Now we're going to survey the menu system based on non-wireless first, and then we'll take a look at it in the various wireless modes. Because actually in the radio wireless modes, we have some of the most exciting features in the world of speed lighting. So there's a peek at the 580EX LCD compared to the 600EX-RT LCD, and you can see the 600 is 25% bigger or so. So take a look even at how big ETTL is. So much easier to read everything, 35 millimeters. Everything on the 600EX is easier to read because the LCD is bigger. They're using dot matrix technology. They're basically able to turn on and off individual pixels on the screen to form letters, to form icons. And so one of the things that you'll see throughout the evening, for instance, where our previous generations of Speedlights had the icons baked into the LCD, meaning it was on or it was off, but those little portions of that LCD never did anything other than, say, show the custom function icon or show the letter L for ETTL. And on the 600EX system, we have that dot matrix capability, and so the screen just continues to change. If you're thinking about getting your first Speedlight, I have to say I think the 600EX is a great choice. A lot of people think, oh, I only need it if I want to work in radio. But if you think about it, as you'll see as we go through this show tonight, the user interface in the 600EX is so much simpler, so much easier to understand, that you're going to find pathways to success much more rapidly than on the previous generation of Speedlights. So the mode button. The mode button, as I said, has been moved down to the side out of the function button row and made very large, so it's easy. Basically, we're going to start smashing the mode button. And on the 600EX, there are 5 modes in non-wireless mode. 3 of them are very familiar to us who have shot with the 580EX and the EX2. We've got ETTL, which is Canon's automatic flash system. We've got manual, which is where you're going to dial the power in yourself. We've got multi, which is where you turn the Speedlight basically into a disco strobe for a short period of time by telling it how many flashes and how many flashes per second. So you can do stroboscopic photography. And then we've got the 2 modes down at the bottom, external auto and external manual. Actually, external auto is a function that we've had around in the 580EX2. We'll talk about those 2 modes, but Canon, rather than implement it through a custom function, which is where you'll find it on the 580EX2, they've actually brought it out and made it part of the 5 mode functions. So when you push the mode button in non-wireless mode, you're basically going to cycle from ETTL to manual to multi to external auto to external manual, and then cycle back to the top at ETTL. So let's take a look at ETTL. And what I've shown here, just as a quick reference, on the right-hand side of the screen is the LCD from a 580EX. And I want to take you through the buttons. We're going to go look button by button by button. So if you've got your 600EX handy and you want to try to follow along, this would be a great point. So the first button, you're going to see this is pretty consistent all the way through, whether we're working wireless or non-wireless. The first button has been dedicated to zoom and then to custom functions. It's the only button on the system that's actually dual function, meaning it's the only button that if you push it once, you're going to go into the zoom functions, and if you press and hold it, you're going to go down to custom functions. All right? So that button, by the way, is very similar. We've had on the 580EX, you recall, the same kind of relationship. You press and hold the leftmost button to access custom functions, but the zoom button was all the way over here on the right. Now in terms of zoom, I'll just give you a quick, short lesson in zoom. This is my son Tony, who's been conscripted on many occasions to stand in as my model. And I just did this quick shot to show you the difference. I use zoom as a built-in light modifier. All right? I use zoom as a way to create a vignette, throw a slash of light when I'm just running and gunning. So this is the 600EX zoom capability. And one of the things I appreciate about the new light is that at its widest setting, we now can zoom it out to 20 millimeters. Now the engineer's idea behind the zoom function of the Speedlight is that it will follow changes in the lenses on your cameras, either because you're changing your prime lenses or because you're using a zoom lens, and it's going to reposition that flash tube so that the light is concentrated basically on what the world is seeing. And that's very, very helpful if you're a run-and-gun photojournalist, okay? I'm a portraitist. I'm not a run-and-gun shooter, but I do like the fact that when I'm shooting an Apollo softbox, and I'll show you a photo of that later this evening. So it's a softbox, it's 43 inches in diameter, it has a silver foil lining. I can go to that 20 millimeter manual zoom setting and fill up that softbox. Okay, I don't have to use a Stoff and Dome diffuser which eats up a couple stops of light. I just hit that 20 millimeter zoom setting and I can fill up that softbox, or I can fill up a large umbrella. So that's very, very handy. And then on the other end, okay, notice how as I continue to zoom, and there are, by the way, several settings. So there's a 24 millimeter setting that's not shown on this slide. There's a 70 millimeter setting that would sit over there. There's a 135 millimeter setting between those two. But I did six of the basic ones. Notice how the center of the frame gets brighter. These were shot in manual mode. So I'm using zoom as that creative built-in modifier. If you're trying to throw light a good distance, you're photographing birds, or you're photographing gorillas, or sports, or whatever, and you need a little bit of fill flash, zooming, even though you might not be shooting at 200 millimeters on your lens, zooming manually to 200 millimeters is going to concentrate that light to the center of the frame, and you'll likely get the fill flash that you need at a greater distance. So that's the zoom button, all right? We'll talk about custom functions towards the end of the program. Now the second button over in ETTL, this is flash exposure compensation. And one of the things I want to call out is that it does not say FEC, rather it just says plus/minus. Now when we jump over to manual in a few frames, you're going to see that that same plus/minus symbol is used as the manual power setting in manual. So in a couple of instances, we need to be familiar with the idea that we're using the same icon depending upon the mode. In case of ETTL, plus/minus means flash exposure compensation. If you're not familiar with ETTL, it's basically the automatic flash mode where the camera sends out a pre-flash, meters that, compares that meter reading to a couple of ambient meter readings, and sets the flash power automatically. I like to think of flash exposure compensation as being the opportunity I have as a photographer to fine-tune the camera's decision, because ultimately the camera doesn't know what's in my head visually, and flash exposure compensation gives me the opportunity to adjust the camera's calculations up or down. So if I wanted to increase flash exposure compensation, I would hit the plus/minus button, and then that line would highlight. So on the left of the screen, it's showing basically zeroed flash exposure compensation, and then over on the right, I've dialed it up two-thirds of a stop. All right, rather than saying those fractions 2/3, you'll see that it says 0.7. So that's taking the camera's calculation for what's the proper amount of flash power and adding to it, at my instruction, 2/3 of a stop of additional brightness. So that's what flash exposure compensation does. And one thing to keep in mind, there are 3 places that we can dial flash exposure compensation in. We can do it directly through the Speedlite, which is what I'm showing up here on the screen. You can do it through the viewfinder of your camera by hitting the FEC button on your camera, and you may have that flashbulb plus or minus button, or you might have actually the AF lock button on the back. So to look in your user manual to find out which button is the flash exposure compensation button on the camera. The third place you can dial in flash exposure compensation, but it's not too practical, is actually on the camera's LCD. Here's the thing to remember about flash exposure compensation. If you dial any setting in directly through the Speedlite, which by substitution is also by the camera's LCD, then it will lock you out of dialing in any flash exposure compensation through the viewfinder. So a lot of wedding photographers, for instance, like to adjust flash exposure compensation through the viewfinder, but if they change their workflow just a little bit and dialed in directly to the back of the Speedlite, and then they didn't zero it out, they'll find that the viewfinder flash exposure compensation is locked out. It's not cumulative. You don't add 2/3 of a stop in the Speedlite and then say, oh, I want more, and you add another stop through the viewfinder. It's either or, but if there's any amount set in the viewfinder, or excuse me, on the Speedlite, then you're locked out of the viewfinder in terms of changing that. So that's just a little gotcha in that regard. Flash exposure bracketing is the third button. I don't ever bracket my flash. I did in the film days. I used to bracket a lot of my flash. I'd take 9 shots to get 1 shot. I'd bracket my exposure up and down, and I'd bracket my flash at each one of those ambient exposure meetings in the film days, because I had no instant feedback. In a digital world, flash exposure bracketing, for me, is not really a necessary tool. So we're just going to jump over. Sync. Sync is the fourth button. Sync is a very important part of any Speedliter's workflow. I'll show you a few photographs, and I'm going to talk to you again kind of very quickly about the various types of sync and the difference between high-speed sync and second curtain sync and first curtain sync. So one of the things to know is that as you press the sync button, your camera defaults when it turns on, and you put fresh batteries in, it turns on, it defaults to first curtain sync. There is no icon for first curtain sync. So the way you know that you're in first curtain sync is that you don't see the icon for high-speed sync, and you don't see the icon for second curtain sync. Now, there's the icon for high-speed sync on the left. There's the icon in exactly the same spot. This is different than the 580EX. It's different than the 430. On those cameras, because those icons were hard baked into the screen, those icons appeared in the case of high-speed sync on the top, and then in the second curtain sync down towards the middle of the left-hand side. And you had to know you had to look in 2 different spots. Now you just remember, okay, the sync icon is going to be there, and if I see the 3 triangles, that's second curtain sync. If I see the flashbolt H, that's high-speed sync, and if I don't see either of those 2, I'm in first curtain sync, all right? You just hit the sync button, and it's going to keep looping through those, all right? Now let's take a quick look at high-speed sync, because this is an important tool. This is one of the things that sets speed lighting apart from using studio strobes, because studio strobes do not high-speed sync, all right? So here's a photograph of my friend Diallo. We're outdoors. I'm shooting a relatively wide aperture in full sun, and I look at Diallo and I say, you know, I want a little bit of, I want some catch light. I want a little bit of fill light on his face. I'm shooting a 3200th of a second. So I take my speed light, I put it in the hot shoe, I turn it on, and the camera senses that that speed light is in the hot shoe. So when I push the button, even with the camera in manual mode, the speed light is going to cause the camera to change the shutter speed, specifically from a 3200th of a second down to a 200th of a second. A lot of folks who don't like flash because they don't understand sync. The camera basically takes control in manual mode and says, all right, I'm programmed that when a speed light is in the hot shoe, based on the design of my curtains in the shutter mechanism, I can only sync up to 100 or 200th of a second, which is a full sensor camera. The APS-C and the 1DX, so the 7D, the Rebels and so on, and the 1DX sync at a 250th of a second. But in either case, manual mode is yours to control until you turn on that speed light. And then the camera's going to make sure that the sync speed is not exceeded. And that's why a lot of daytime photographs at wide aperture, when you try to do fill flash, are blown out. People look at that and they say, I hate flash because it puts out too much light. It's not the flash that's putting out that light. It's the 3.5 stop change in shutter speed that's killing that shot. So what do? We hit that sync button on the back of our speed light. That's effectively a permission button. You're now telling the camera it's okay for you to change the way the speed light fires. And rather than put out one big pulse of light, it turns that speed light for a very short period of time into a machine gun of light. That speed light turns itself on and off 30,000 times a second. It effectively becomes a continuous light source, which means that as the 2 curtains are chasing themselves across the shutter at a super fast speed, the speed light's going to be on the entire time. So now look what happens. I hit that high-speed sync button. I fire the frame off. I get that nice little bit of fill flash. I get those catch lights in his eyes. And on we go. All right? So the difference between those 2 shots was literally pushing a button, the sync button, okay, which is on the 600, the leftmost button, a very, very useful button. Now in terms of the other sync, so I want you to think about high-speed sync as being sync that you would use when the ambient light is really bright. I want you to think about second curtain sync as being the sync that you'll use when the ambient light is really dim. Second curtain sync applies when we have extended shutter speed. So for instance here in these two demo shots, the shutter was 1/8 of a second. In the first image on the left, first curtain sync, the flash fires at the beginning of the 1/8 of a second. It locks in, basically burns in the motorcycle, shows you the bushes, but the sky in the background continues to burn because it's continuous lights, and the head and tail lights on the motorcycle continue to burn in. So on first curtain sync, when we have a longer shutter speed and a subject that's in motion with a light on it, it doesn't look normal. Those laser beams coming out of that motorcycle don't necessarily look right. So again, you hit that sync button and you're telling the camera, okay, on longer shutter speeds, rather than fire the speed light at the beginning, fire it just before you close that second curtain. So what then happens is the shutter opens, the first curtain opens, the continuous lights begin to burn in, burn in, burn in. This motorcycle moves across the frame, headlights are burning in, the sky's burning in around the edges. And just before the shutter closes, it fires the flash. And the flash is what's allowing us to see the motorcycle. So now we have an image that suggests the motion, the forward motion of that motorcycle. And again, the difference between the two is only the quick push of a button. All right? Wedding photographers, dance floors at the reception with the disco lights going off everywhere and everyone out there having a great time. You probably want to use second curtain sync. If you have second curtain sync activated and you're firing your speed light at 1/30th of a second or faster, the camera's going to ignore your suggestion and it will fire it in first curtain sync because there's not enough time at 1/30th or 1/60th or 125th of a second to really make second curtain sync work well. But 1/15th of a second, 1/8, and so on, longer shutter speeds, second curtain sync can definitely be a creative tool. Now we're going to find that those, when we jump over to manual mode here, I hit the mode button on the back of the speed light, and basically ETTL is now replaced by M for manual mode. In ETTL, the camera was setting the flash power. In manual mode, I'm setting the flash power. So the button structure is very much the same in ETTL and in manual, with a couple of exceptions. The first button is still the zoom and custom function gateway button. The second button, while it has the same exact icon that the Speedlite had in ETTL that button was flash exposure compensation. In manual mode, that is the flash power button. So you're going to push that button, and that's basically where you're going to then use the select wheel to dial the power up or down, and then hit the set button when you get to the power level that you want. Okay? And then we skip over the third button. There's no function there, straight to the fourth, and it's exactly the same as it was in ETTL in terms of being the sync button. We have the loop that goes from first curtain to high-speed sync to second curtain sync back to first curtain with all of the same functionality that we just took a look at. Multi-mode. Multi-mode is an interesting and yet challenging speed lighting mode. Because in multi-mode, as I mentioned, we're taking that speed light and we're saying, I want you to fire a certain number of times at a certain power level at a certain rate per second. And what you'll end up with, the image that you see on the right, is basically a baseball player walking across the front of my lens. I told the speed light to fire 10 or 15 times at a certain interval, and that's the kind of image that you end up with. Now the challenge is, if you say fire 15 flashes, 5 flashes per second, that's a 3-second exposure. And that's the part that makes multi or stroboscopic speed lighting a challenge. You need to have a very, very dark set, if not perfectly black set. Because you're photographing things in motion, you have the whole cycle of motion. And if that cycle takes a couple of seconds, literally just think about taking a 2-second exposure and how dark it would have to be so that light leaking in from underneath the door or in through the cracks in the windows or whatever doesn't get into the frame. Now, a lot of the 2012 cameras, the 1DX, 5D Mark III also have a new mode on the cameras themselves, which I haven't played with too much, but in my initial attempts, it seems very promising to be able to create similar kind of images without actually having to use the flash at all, in terms of the camera taking multiple images and visually stacking those on top of each other. So multiple exposure mode, very much the same thing. So you hit multi-mode because you feel adventuresome. You're going to do something very creative. That first button is still the zoom button and the custom function button. The second button is manual flash power. You have to tell the Speedlite what flash power to use. And by the way, multi-mode works just fine in wireless mode as well. So you can have a master and slave situation and be telling the slaves to change their flash power as well. So the plus minus in this case is exactly what it was in manual mode. It is the manual flash power setting. The third button over that says multi, that is the total number of flashes. That is the total number of flashes. So if you want 15 flashes, you hit multi, you dial in the number 15. If you want 6 flashes, you dial in 6. Whatever the total number of flashes you want is the number that you put into that multi. And there are limitations, by the way. The user's manual has a chart in the back that says, at such and such a power level, here is the maximum number of flashes that you can get. So if you need 15 flashes, you should refer to that chart and say, okay, then in this case, I can fire only at 1/8 power or lower. And the reason for that is because a Speedlite needs to recycle very, very quickly. And in order to get that many more flashes out, it has to fire the flash at a lower level. And that chart is the gateway to understanding that. Then hertz, the very last button on the right. Hertz is basically the number of flashes per second. So in my example where I said 15 flashes total, 5 per second, I dial in 5 on the hertz. So those of us who are mathematically oriented, we say, okay, 15 flashes total, 5 per second means I have to have at least 3 seconds on my shutter. It's up to you, the photographer, to dial in the shutter speed on your camera to 3 seconds or longer. If you set your shutter speed to 1/2 second, you're only going to get 2 flashes. The Speedlite will stop firing when the shutter closes. So that's another one of those gotchas. You have to know that when you're working in stroboscopic or working in multi-mode, that you need to change up your shutter speed so that it's at least as long as it takes the Speedlite to fire all of the flashes. And that duration is basically a function of how many total flashes and how many flashes per second. Okay? External auto. This is the flash mode that came up to the mode button with the introduction of the 600EX. And on the 580EX2, Canon put this little mysterious object on the front panel. A lot of us thought, oh, maybe it's some sort of sync port, or maybe it's some sort of communication device. Essentially what that is an old school thyristor circuit. So if any of you ever shot with the old Vivitar 283 or any of the other flashes of that era, you'll recall that you would basically have a sensor on the front of the Speedlite, and you would somehow communicate to the flash, here is the ASA, that's how far back these units typically went. Here's the ASA, we would say ISO these days. Here's the ASA, and here's the aperture that I'm working at. And then the camera would basically fire the flash, and the flash would stay on until the thyristor circuit filled up with enough light to basically quench the flash. It's another way, an early way, if you will, to do automatic flash. So in external auto, which was a custom function on, is a custom function on the 580EX and now a mainline mode on the 600EX-RT, we're still using that sensor on the front of the Speedlite. And if you have a 2007 or newer camera model, that does not mean that you found a 20D brand new that nobody had ever bought last week. That does not make the 20D a 2012 model. All right, 2007 models, 40D typically, a newer camera. External auto will communicate with the camera, and it will take the ISO setting and the aperture setting from the camera so that you don't have to put it in. Now, I have to confess, in a world where ETTL works really, really well for a lot of us, all right, once you get an understanding of what it does and the need to adjust it with flash exposure compensation, having external auto can be a bit of a head scratcher. You think, why would I want to use this? Well, one of the things I can suggest is that if you've worked with ETTL and you know that there's that pre-flash metering mode, all right, and if you're using other lights that have old school optical sensors, what I now call flash burst sensors, where they're going to fire the flash or fire the studio strobes based upon seeing a bright burst of light, ETTL messes that up because when the camera sends out the pre-flash, the studio strobes think that it's time to fire, and they fire early. So in this case, you have automatic metering, but there is no pre-flash. Basically, the flash turns itself on when the camera says to go, and then the flash turns itself off based upon the light coming back into that little sensor. Now, I don't think this is a total ETTL killer, but I think it's kind of nice to have this functionality. Wedding photographers are the folks that I find who like this functionality the most. So if you shoot weddings or you're getting into that field, keep external auto as a metering mode in mind, or as a flash mode in mind. Now, in external auto, basically we've got flash, the same thing. We've got zoom and custom functions on that first button. We have flash exposure compensation. So if you're at an event, in a wedding or reception or whatever, and you have the opportunity to pre-light and do the tests, and you say, man, this thing is overexposing, I want to have this thing right when the bride hits that spot, you can use the flash exposure compensation in external auto to fine-tune that so that when the bride does hit that particular spot on the recessional, you've got nice light and you didn't have to worry about it in that regard. Flash exposure bracketing, same thing. It's not a tool that I find useful, so I'm going to jump right over it. Now, external manual. External manual is basically the same external metering mode, except that you have to input the ISO and the aperture. So if you're going to go into external, I would prefer to use auto. But if you have an older camera, you've got that 20D, for instance, or a 30D, you're not going to be able to use external auto, but you absolutely, any EOS camera can use external manual, because in external manual, we're basically going to input that info. So there's the zoom and custom function button again. We skip over button 2 to button 3. We hit that, and that's where we dial in and we tell the camera, or we tell the Speedlite rather, what ISO setting is on the camera. And the reason we have to tell the Speedlite is because we're using that older model camera again, and it can't communicate that through the hot shoe. And then the fourth button, f-stop, it's the aperture that we're using on our lens. Now, I'll give you this little tip. You recall in external auto that there was on that second button, flash exposure compensation. If you have a good grasp of the exposure triangle, you can basically fib to your Speedlite in external manual and change up either the aperture or the ISO setting in the same way that you would use a flash exposure compensation button. So for instance, if your ISO is set to 200 and you want the Speedlite to throw out more light than it's metering, then change the ISO to 100. And it's going to, because it thinks that the sensitivity of the camera is low, it's going to double the amount of light that it's throwing out. Conversely, if you think this thing is overlighting and you want to dim it and your ISO is set on your camera to 200, then you can change the ISO to 400 on the Speedlite, and it's going to assume that because you're at a higher sensitivity, it doesn't need to throw out as much light. So that, again, is a very old school. Anybody here remember working with Vivitars that way? We're dating ourselves.